In the German city of Ludwigshafen sits the largest integrated chemical complex in the world. It belongs to BASF. It is a sprawling, metallic labyrinth the size of a small city, consuming more natural gas than the entire country of Switzerland. For decades, this facility was the beating heart of European industrial dominance. It took raw, invisible inputs and turned them into the physical building blocks of the modern economy: plastics, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, and synthetic fibers. But today, a strange quiet is creeping into the complex. Key plants within the facility are being permanently shut down. Thousands of jobs are quietly disappearing. The machinery is not broken. The workers have not forgotten how to operate it. The company is simply doing the math. And the math says that manufacturing in Europe no longer makes financial sense. This silence in Ludwigshafen is not an isolated corporate restructuring. It is a warning siren. Europe, the continent that invented modern industry, is quietly, systematically deindustrializing. For the past 15 years, a vast and invisible wealth transfer has been bleeding the old world dry. The numbers are stark, yet rarely discussed in polite political circles. In 2008, the economies of the European Union and the United States were roughly equal in size. Today, the American economy is nearly 50% larger. While the United States printed tech billionaires and China built a manufacturing empire, Europe chose a different path. It built a paradise of leisure, regulation, and social safety nets. But paradise has a price, and now the bill is coming due. The gap in living standards between the average European and the average American is widening at a pace not seen since the aftermath of the Second World War. Europeans are working less, paying more, and slowly waking up to a chilling reality. They are getting poorer, and the mechanisms draining their wealth were put in place by their own leaders.
To understand how a continent loses its wealth, you have to look at the foundation its wealth was built upon. For the last 30 years, Europe operated on a geopolitical magic trick. It was a grand, unspoken bargain that allowed European nations to fund the most generous welfare states in human history. The formula was simple. Europe outsourced its defense to the United States, keeping military budgets artificially low. It outsourced its export growth to China, feeding high-end machinery and luxury cars into a booming Asian middle class. And most importantly, it outsourced its energy to Russia. Cheap, abundant, piped Russian gas was the invisible subsidy that kept German factories humming, Italian mills spinning, and European living standards artificially high. It was a perfectly calibrated machine. As long as the gas flowed, the exports shipped, and the Americans guarded the sea lanes, Europe could afford to focus inward. It could afford 6 weeks of paid vacation, early retirements, universal health care, and heavily subsidized housing. It was a golden age of social democracy. But it was an illusion. It was an economy built on the assumption that global conditions would never change. The warning signs began flashing after the 2008 financial crisis. While the United States ruthlessly restructured its banks and poured capital into a terrifying new sector called the internet economy, Europe hesitated. It spent a decade tangled in the sovereign debt crisis, bailing out Greece, Italy, and Spain. To keep the Eurozone from fracturing, the European Central Bank pushed interest rates below zero. It was an unprecedented experiment. Money became free. But instead of using this free money to build the next Google, Amazon, or Tesla, European capital flowed into safe, stagnant assets. Real estate prices soared. Productivity flatlined. The continent stopped inventing the future and started managing its decline. Politicians pointed to the high quality of life, the walkable cities, and the historic architecture as proof of superiority. But underneath the cobblestones, the tectonic plates of the global economy were shifting. The United States became the undisputed master of software, artificial intelligence, and cloud computing. China dominated hardware, batteries, and solar panels. Europe found itself caught in the middle, producing excellent combustion engine cars in a world preparing to abandon them. The historical blind spot was fatal. European leaders believed that the global order was a permanent plateau. They believed that wealth, once acquired, was a permanent condition. They forgot the oldest law of markets. Wealth is not a museum exhibit.
It must be defended, adapted, and rebuilt every single day. And the triad that sustained the European dream was about to violently crack.
In the glass-paneled offices of Brussels, a new philosophy took hold. If Europe could no longer lead the world in technological innovation or raw manufacturing output, it would lead the world in rules. This became known as the Brussels effect. The European Union positioned itself as the global regulatory superpower. Armies of lawmakers drafted the General Data Protection Regulation, the AI Act, and sprawling environmental, social, and governance frameworks. The logic was seductive. Even if American tech giants and Chinese manufacturers dominated the market, they would have to bend to European standards if they wanted access to European consumers. Regulation became Europe's primary export. But regulation does not create wealth, it only taxes it. While lawmakers celebrated their moral leadership, the executives sitting in the boardrooms of Europe's largest companies were staring at a terrifying set of ledgers. Men like Martin Brudermüller, then CEO of BASF, and the leadership at Volkswagen and Siemens faced a brutal calculation. They operated in a global market. They had a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to remain competitive. But the environment around them was becoming actively hostile to capital. The breaking of the Russian energy supply severed the lifeline of cheap power. Suddenly, natural gas in Europe cost up to 5 times what it cost in the United States. Then came the bureaucratic friction. Building a new industrial facility in Germany required navigating years of permitting, environmental impact studies, and local opposition. At the exact same time, the United States government passed the Inflation Reduction Act. It was a masterstroke of industrial poaching. The American government offered hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies, tax credits, and cheap energy to any company willing to build green tech and manufacturing plants on American soil. The trap was set. European executives were caught between domestic politicians demanding they stay and global market forces demanding they leave. They made the only rational choice. They began a quiet, methodical exodus. They did not announce massive layoffs overnight. Instead, they simply stopped investing in Europe. When it came time to build a new battery plant, a new chemical facility, or a new research lab, the capital bypassed France and Germany. It flowed to Texas, Ohio, and South Carolina. The money went where it was treated best. The European regulators had built a perfect, heavily guarded cage, only to realize the birds had already flown. The consequences of this exodus do not appear in a single dramatic market crash. There is no Lehman Brothers moment. Deindustrialization is a slow-motion economic eviction. It happens one closed foundry, one relocated research center, and one frozen hiring budget at a time. By the time the public realizes what is happening, the infrastructure is already gone. The crisis escalated fiercely when the European auto industry, the crown jewel of the continent's manufacturing might, hit a wall. For decades, German engineering was considered untouchable, but the transition to electric vehicles changed the rules of the game. An electric car is fundamentally a battery with a computer attached to it. It requires cheap energy to manufacture, massive software engineering talent, and a deep supply chain of critical minerals. Europe lacked all three. Chinese automakers like BYD and MG, backed by years of state subsidies and raw material dominance, began flooding European ports with electric vehicles that were vastly cheaper and technologically comparable to European models. The European automakers, burdened by high energy costs, legacy union contracts, and massive regulatory compliance, found themselves severely outmatched on their home turf. The dominoes began to fall. Suppliers to the auto industry, the thousands of mid-sized, family-owned engineering firms that form the backbone of the German economy, saw their orders dry up. The stress rippled outward into the broader population. The European middle class, historically shielded from extreme poverty by the welfare state, began to feel a tightening grip. Inflation surged, driven by the structural increase in energy and food costs. But unlike in the United States, where wages often rose to meet inflation, European wages stagnated. The currency markets reflected this divergence. The euro, once positioned as a serious rival to the US dollar, steadily lost its purchasing power. The economic pain became visceral. Electricity bills doubled. The dream of homeownership evaporated for an entire generation of young Europeans, locked out by high interest rates and a lack of new construction.
real disposable income shrank. The social contract was breaking. Young, highly educated tech workers, engineers, and scientists looked at their paychecks. A software developer in Berlin or Paris realized they were earning less than half of what their counterpart in Austin or Silicon Valley made while paying higher taxes. The brain drain accelerated. Talent is the most mobile asset on Earth, and it began crossing the Atlantic in search of opportunity. Europe was transforming into a museum. It remained a spectacular place to visit. The food was excellent, the streets were safe, and the history was perfectly preserved. But beneath the surface of the tourist economy, the engines of wealth creation were shutting down. The continent was becoming a consumer of foreign technology, protected by an aging military alliance and reliant on imported energy. European governments attempted to react. They drafted their own subsidy programs to counter the Americans and the Chinese. But the European Union is a fractured entity, requiring consensus among 27 nations. Their response was slow, fragmented, and buried in administrative paperwork. They offered loans instead of tax credits. They mandated rigid environmental targets that strangled the very industries they were trying to save.
They refused to acknowledge the harsh truth of the global market. You cannot regulate your way to prosperity. You cannot tax your way to innovation. When you make it a crime to fail, you make it impossible to succeed. The factories continued to go silent. The capital continued to flee. And the continent, slowly, comfortably, drifted toward irrelevance. The arc of economic history is ruthless. It does not care about past glory, and it does not respect beautiful architecture. The shifting of wealth away from Europe is not an accident of fate. It is the predictable outcome of incentives. It is the inescapable law of markets asserting itself. When a society prioritizes safety above all else, it inadvertently kills the very dynamism required to maintain that safety. Europe built a magnificent fortress of consumer protection, labor rights, and environmental standards. But a fortress is only effective if there is a thriving economy inside to protect. The tragedy of the European model is that it succeeded too well at its original goal. It smoothed out the rough edges of capitalism. It eliminated the extreme highs and the extreme lows, creating a comfortable, predictable middle. But in the 21st century, the global economy is defined by extremes. The exponential growth of artificial intelligence, the brutal geopolitics of energy, and the race for space require massive capital allocation, rapid iteration, and an appetite for risk. By outlawing the risk, Europe outlawed the reward. The continent is aging rapidly. The ratio of workers to retirees is shrinking, placing an unbearable strain on the generous pension systems that defined the post-war consensus. To fund these obligations, governments will have to extract even more taxes from a shrinking, less productive industrial base. It is a mathematical death spiral. The leaders in Brussels continue to draft new directives. They continue to fine American tech companies billions of dollars for monopolistic practices, treating these penalties as a